British, North Atlantic, March 17th, 1943, 0347 hours. Korvettenkapitän Aline Richter of U-847 peered through her periscope at Convoy WX-394, watching the merchant vessels maintain their predictable formation as her Wolfpack maneuvered into attack position, completely unaware that in precisely 12 minutes, her entire understanding of submarine warfare would be shattered like steel struck by a torpedo. The ocean around her appeared empty except for the lumbering merchantmen and their seemingly inadequate destroyer escorts, the pre-dawn darkness concealing what German U-boat doctrine had always exploited, the vast expanse of ocean that made convoy protection impossible beyond a narrow defensive perimeter, when suddenly, from 3 different compass bearings simultaneously, depth charges began exploding with mathematical precision around her submarine. Not the random carpet bombing that German tactics had learned to evade, not the scattered attacks that gave U-boats time to dive deep and escape, but as a coordinated pattern of underwater explosions that materialized from multiple directions without warning. U-847's hull groaned under the synchronized pressure waves as Richter was thrown against the periscope housing, salt water spraying from ruptured pipe joints throughout the control room. Her sonar operator, Obermaschinist Maria Kellner, vanished in a cascade of sparks from her destroyed equipment, and as emergency lighting flickered on in the smoke-filled compartment, Richter realized with crystalline clarity that the Allies had developed something the Kriegsmarine submarine experts had deemed tactically impossible. Hunter-killer groups that could coordinate attacks from multiple vessels with such precision that escape routes were eliminated before U-boats could even identify the threat. The forest of hydrophones that had just moments before seemed to protect her submarine now transmitted nothing but the terrifying sound of coordinated propeller beats closing from all directions, each destroyer maintaining perfect spacing and timing as if controlled by a single tactical mind that could see through the ocean's depths and predict every evasive maneuver that German submarine doctrine had perfected over years of successful operations. The German U-boat arm, refined through spectacular victories against British merchant shipping in 1940, devastating attacks on Allied convoys throughout 1941, and the catastrophic success of Operation Pokenschlag off the American eastern seaboard in early 1942, had always relied on the fundamental mathematical limitation of convoy escorts. The absolute impossibility of defending every approach vector to a merchant convoy simultaneously across the vast expanse of the North Atlantic Ocean. The Wolfpack tactics that had served the Kriegsmarine so effectively since Großadmiral Karl Dönitz perfected them during the previous war assumed that escort vessels were permanently tied to convoy protection duties, creating predictable defensive patterns that experienced submarine commanders could analyze, time with mathematical precision, and exploit through coordinated attacks that overwhelmed defensive capabilities by presenting more targets than escorts could possibly engage simultaneously. German U-boat commanders like Richter had been trained at the prestigious submarine warfare school at Kiel-Vick, where they learned the sophisticated art of coordinated pack hunting, how to shadow Allied convoys beyond the effective range of primitive sonar equipment, coordinate devastating surface attacks under the protective cover of darkness, and most importantly, exploit the mathematically proven gaps in escort coverage that must exist when a handful of destroyers and corvettes attempted to protect dozens of heavily loaded merchant vessels spread across dozens of square miles of open ocean. The Kriegsmarine submarine warfare doctrine, developed through meticulous analysis of Allied convoy routes, escort vessel capabilities, and the fundamental limitations of underwater detection equipment, had calculated with scientific precision that no Allied naval force could maintain comprehensive protection of merchant shipping given the enormous distances involved, the limited number of available escort vessels, and the technological constraints of underwater detection equipment. This supreme confidence in German submarine tactical superiority had deep historical roots in naval tradition that valued individual U-boat excellence and innovative tactical thinking over the rigid, coordinated fleet operations that characterized surface naval warfare. A philosophy that had produced legendary submarine aces like Gunther Prien, who penetrated the heavily defended anchorage at Scapa Flow to sink HMS Royal Oak, and Otto Kretschmer, whose individual submarine had destroyed over 200,000 tons of Allied shipping through superior seamanship, tactical brilliance, and the kind of innovative thinking that German naval education fostered above all else. Yet none of these celebrated commanders had ever faced, never even seriously contemplated the tactical possibility of dedicated hunter-killer groups that abandoned convoy protection responsibilities entirely to hunt submarines with the same coordinated wolfpack tactics that German U-boats used so effectively against merchant shipping convoy coverage.
British. The dismissive attitude toward Allied anti-submarine warfare capabilities had been systematically reinforced by the spectacular successes of 1942, when German U-boats had operated with virtual impunity along the American eastern seaboard, sinking over 600 Allied vessels, totaling more than 3.1 million tons of desperately needed shipping in what submarine commanders gleefully called the second happy time. Gross Admiral Dönitz himself had publicly declared that the Allies possessed neither the industrial capacity nor the tactical sophistication necessary to challenge German submarine warfare doctrine, dismissing intelligence reports of improved Allied sonar technology and enhanced depth charge tactics as desperate Allied propaganda designed to conceal the catastrophic failure of their convoy protection system. The German submarine command structure had grown dangerously comfortable with tactical methods that relied heavily on detailed intelligence about convoy departure schedules, carefully planned intercept positions calculated days in advance, and the proven ability of coordinated wolf packs to overwhelm escort defenses through simultaneous attacks launched from multiple compass bearings that made effective defensive response mathematically impossible. This institutional overconfidence was based on rigorous mathematical analysis that seemed absolutely unassailable to German naval theorists. Convoy escorts were fundamentally defensive forces whose primary mission tied them permanently to protecting merchant shipping, which meant they simply could not pursue attacking submarines beyond effective sonar range without abandoning their sacred responsibility to defend the vulnerable cargo vessels that represented Britain's lifeline to survival. The morning of March 17, 1943, marked the first major combat deployment of Task Group 23.7, commanded by Captain Rebecca Morrison aboard the escort carrier USS Altamaha. Supported by the destroyers USS Buckley, USS Reuben James III, and USS Donnell, along with the destroyer escorts USS Thomas and USS Bostwick. This revolutionary naval force represented something entirely unprecedented in the history of naval warfare. A dedicated anti-submarine hunting group with absolutely no convoy protection responsibilities, equipped with cutting-edge sonar technology, experimental underwater weapons, and, most importantly, tactical doctrine specifically designed to hunt and destroy German U-boats using coordinated methods that German submarine warfare theory had never anticipated because such operations had been considered strategically impossible. The established German submarine operational procedures that had proven so successful throughout the early war period were based on detailed analysis of escort vessel behavior patterns that assumed defensive responsibilities would always limit pursuit capabilities, creating windows of opportunity that experienced submarine commanders could exploit to withdraw safely beyond detection range after completing successful torpedo attacks against merchant convoys. When U-847 and 4 other submarines from Wolfpack Eisenhower attempted their carefully coordinated attack against convoy WX-394, following tactical doctrine that had been proven successful in dozens of previous engagements, they confidently expected to face the traditional and entirely predictable pattern of Allied escort response. Destroyers and corvettes racing immediately to the approximate position of torpedo launches, dropping patterns of depth charges in the general area where submarines were estimated to have withdrawn to, then returning promptly to convoy protection duties once sonar contact was lost and the immediate threat to merchant shipping had apparently passed. Instead, Richter and her fellow submarine commanders encountered Task Group 23.7, whose vessels immediately and completely abandoned the merchant convoy to the protection of its regular escort screen and began an unprecedented coordinated pursuit operation that would fundamentally revolutionize the tactical and strategic dynamics of submarine warfare throughout the remainder of the Atlantic campaign. The profound shock of this first encounter with hunter-killer tactics was meticulously documented in Richter's detailed war diary, recovered intact when U-847 was forced to surface and surrender after 18 hours of relentless pursuit that had exhausted her batteries, depleted her compressed air reserves, and left her crew in a state of psychological collapse from the stress of facing an enemy that violated every assumption about how anti-submarine warfare was supposed to function according to established German naval doctrine. The enemy destroyers did not return to convoy protection duties as our tactical manual explicitly states they must, Richter wrote, in what would prove to be one of the last German submarine war diary entries to describe hunter-killer group operations as tactically incomprehensible and strategically impossible. Instead, they continued pursuit with apparently unlimited operational endurance, coordinating their search patterns through communication methods that we cannot understand or counter. Long-range aircraft appeared from compass bearings that should have represented empty ocean according to our intelligence estimates, maintaining contact with surface vessels through coordination techniques that seem to violate the basic principles of naval warfare as we have been taught to understand them. Our standard evasion procedures, which have proven effective in dozens of previous encounters with Allied escort vessels, proved completely useless against pursuers who seemed to anticipate our tactical movements and coordinate their attacks from multiple surface vessels simultaneously, creating search patterns that eliminated all traditional escape routes and maintained contact even when we employed our most sophisticated underwater maneuvering techniques.
The diary entry, subsequently analyzed by German naval intelligence officers who initially dismissed it as the panicked exaggeration of an inexperienced commander under extreme stress, actually marked the beginning of a fundamental transformation in submarine warfare that would ultimately result in the destruction of 783 German U-boats and completely alter the strategic balance of power in the crucial Battle of the Atlantic that would determine whether Britain could continue fighting and whether the planned invasion of Western Europe could ever become operational reality. The German submarine service, despite its undeniable technical excellence, superior individual training, and proven tactical sophistication developed through years of successful combat operations, was about to face an enemy innovation that would render their traditional operational methods not merely ineffective or outdated, but actively suicidal for any submarine crew unfortunate enough to encounter the new Allied hunter-killer groups that were being deployed in increasing numbers throughout the North Atlantic shipping lanes. The immediate psychological impact was both devastating and unprecedented, as German submarine commanders who had operated with supreme confidence and tactical superiority for over 3 years of successful warfare suddenly found themselves facing coordinated attacks from multiple directions, aircraft support that materialized from apparently empty horizons with no advance warning, and pursuing vessels that seemed to possess unlimited operational endurance along with mysterious coordination capabilities that German naval intelligence could not explain or counter. The fundamental tactical assumptions that had governed successful U-boat operations since the beginning of the war, assumptions that had been validated through hundreds of successful attacks against Allied convoys, were about to be proven not merely incorrect, but catastrophically wrong as Allied naval forces demonstrated that they had developed not just revolutionary new technology, but an entirely new strategic approach to anti-submarine warfare that German doctrine had never anticipated, never prepared for, and could not effectively counter using existing tactical methods and operational procedures. Korvettenkapitän Richter, struggling to maintain control of her damaged submarine as depth charges continued exploding around U-847 with terrifying precision, realized that she was witnessing the birth of a new form of naval warfare that would transform the Battle of the Atlantic from a contest between individual submarines and defensive escorts into a systematic hunt where German U-boats had become the prey rather than the predators they had always considered themselves to be throughout their years of devastating success against Allied merchant shipping. The transformation was absolute and irreversible. By May 1945, when Gross Admiral Dönitz ordered the surrender of all German U-boats, the once mighty submarine fleet that had terrorized Allied shipping for over 5 years lay scattered across the ocean floor. 783 vessels and their crews consumed by a revolution in naval warfare that German doctrine had dismissed as impossible until it was far too late to adapt. Fregattenkapitän Ingrid Brenner, one of only 47 U-boat commanders to survive the war after encountering hunter-killer groups, stood on the dock at Portsmouth Naval Base on May 12, 1945, watching her submarine U-991 being boarded by Allied technical intelligence teams. The vessel that had once prowled the Atlantic with lethal efficiency now served as a museum piece, its sophisticated technology rendered obsolete by tactical innovations that had turned submarines from predators into prey. "We were the wolves," Brenner wrote in her post-war memoir, "and suddenly we discovered we were sheep being hunted by shepherds who knew our every move before we made it. The ocean that had been our hunting ground became our graveyard, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing our training or experience could do to save us." The statistics told a story of systematic annihilation that defied German expectations. From March 1943, when Task Group 23.7 first demonstrated coordinated hunter-killer tactics, until the end of the war, German U-boats suffered a 75% casualty rate in encounters with dedicated anti-submarine groups. The average survival time for a U-boat crew after first contact with hunter-killer forces dropped from the pre-1943 average of 43 minutes to less than 12 minutes, barely enough time to send a final radio transmission before disappearing forever beneath the Atlantic waves. Oberbootsmann Peter Hofmann, sonar operator aboard U-634 and one of the few survivors of the massacre at Grid Square BE 3847, where 4 submarines were destroyed in a single coordinated operation, described the psychological terror that consumed German submarine crews once they realized the fundamental nature of warfare had changed. The hydrophones that had been our eyes and ears became instruments of torture. Every propeller sound could be the beginning of the end. We learned to fear silence because it meant they were coordinating their attack. And we learned to fear noise because it meant they had found us. There was no safe sound in the ocean anymore. The hunter-killer groups had achieved something German naval theorists had declared mathematically impossible. They had made the vast Atlantic Ocean feel small and confining.
transforming unlimited space into a trap where submarines could be methodically hunted down and destroyed through systematic application of coordinated tactics that eliminated traditional escape routes.
British Captain Rebecca Morrison, whose task group 23.7 had pioneered the tactics that would spread throughout the Allied anti-submarine fleet, later explained the psychological warfare aspect that proved as devastating as the physical destruction. We realized that German submarines relied on predictability, knowing how escorts would respond, where safe zones existed, what patterns to expect from defensive forces. So we deliberately violated every assumption they had about naval warfare. We pursued when doctrine said we should return to convoy protection. We coordinated attacks from impossible distances. We maintained contact when traditional methods said we should lose them. We made their expertise work against them. The ripple effects extended far beyond the Battle of the Atlantic. German submarine construction, which had consumed enormous resources and industrial capacity, was revealed as a strategic catastrophe when hunter-killer groups began sinking new U-boats faster than German shipyards could produce them. By late 1944, the average operational lifespan of a newly commissioned U-boat had dropped to 2.3 patrols, making submarine warfare not just tactically futile, but economically devastating for the German war effort. Kapitan zur See Helene Richter, the former U-847 commander whose encounter with coordinated anti-submarine tactics had marked the beginning of Germany's submarine catastrophe, spent 18 months as a prisoner of war analyzing how completely German naval doctrine had misunderstood the nature of modern warfare. Her classified report, written for Allied intelligence services in exchange for improved treatment of German submarine prisoners, provided a professional assessment of institutional failure that would influence naval strategy for decades. The German submarine service entered this war believing that individual excellence and tactical innovation could overcome any systematic approach to anti-submarine warfare, Richter wrote. We were trained to think like hunters, but we never considered that we might become the hunted. Our entire doctrine was based on exploiting the limitations of defensive warfare, but we never prepared for enemies who would abandon defensive tactics entirely to hunt us with the same coordination and persistence we used against merchant shipping. Richter's analysis identified the fundamental conceptual error that had doomed German submarine warfare, the assumption that Allied naval forces would remain bound by traditional defensive doctrine, even as German submarines continuously evolved their offensive tactics. We expected them to fight the war we wanted them to fight, protecting convoys according to established patterns that we could exploit. We never imagined they would revolutionize their entire approach to naval warfare just to counter our submarines. The transformation of Allied anti-submarine capabilities had cascading effects throughout German naval strategy. Submarine patrol areas that had been considered safe havens for years became hunting grounds where hunter-killer groups systematically eliminated German vessels. The Bay of Biscay, previously a secure transit route for submarines entering and leaving Atlantic patrol areas, became known among German crews as the Valley of Death after coordinated Allied operations sank 47 U-boats in a 6-month period. Korvettenkapitän Sabine Müller, who commanded the submarine tender Weser, and witnessed the systematic destruction of German submarine capabilities from a logistical perspective, documented the complete breakdown of U-boat operations. By 1944, we were no longer running submarine patrols, we were conducting funeral services. Every boat that left port carried mail for families they would never see again, and every radio transmission from patrol areas sounded like final words from the grave. The psychological impact on German submarine crews became a strategic factor in its own right.
Desertion rates, virtually unknown in the early war years when submarine service was considered elite and glamorous, reached 23% by early 1945 as crews realized that assignment to U-boat duty had become tantamount to a death sentence. Medical officers reported unprecedented rates of combat neurosis, with symptoms ranging from inability to tolerate confined spaces to complete psychological breakdown at the sound of sonar pings. Dr. Margot Friedman, chief medical officer for the 3rd U-boat flotilla, described treating submarine crews who had survived encounters with hunter-killer groups. They exhibited symptoms I had never seen before. Not just battle fatigue or conventional shell shock, but a specific form of trauma related to helplessness. They had been the predators, the ones who controlled when and how combat occurred. Suddenly, they were prey being systematically hunted by enemies who seemed to possess supernatural coordination and unlimited endurance. Many simply could not process the psychological reversal. The technological aspects of hunter-killer success became apparent through captured German intelligence assessments. Unlike German submarines, which relied on sophisticated but individualistic tactics, Allied hunter-killer groups achieved their effectiveness through systematic coordination enabled by advanced communications, integrated sonar networks, and, most crucially, tactical doctrine that prioritized group coordination over individual vessel performance.
British Counter-Admiral Marguerite Schneider, former chief of German Naval Intelligence's Submarine Warfare Division, admitted in her post-war debriefings that German analysis had completely underestimated Allied technological capabilities. We knew they were developing improved sonar and communication systems, but we failed to recognize that technology was enabling tactical revolution. We thought in terms of individual improvements to existing equipment, but they were creating integrated systems that transformed multiple ships into a single hunting organism. The final submarine patrol reports, transmitted in the closing weeks of the war, documented the complete collapse of German submarine effectiveness. U-boat commanders reported that Allied hunter-killer groups had achieved such tactical superiority that even detecting enemy vessels had become impossible, as coordinated sonar networks could track submarines from distances that made attack approaches suicidal. Oberleutnant Circe Carmen Bachmann, commanding U-1187 during the final weeks of the war, transmitted what would become one of the last operational reports from a German submarine. Allied hunter-killer coordination has reached levels that make traditional submarine warfare impossible. They detect us before we detect them, coordinate attacks from multiple vessels before we can identify threats, and pursue with systematic efficiency that eliminates all escape options. Submarine warfare as we have known it is dead. We are no longer weapons of war, we are targets in a shooting gallery controlled by enemies who have mastered tactics we never imagined possible. The strategic consequences extended beyond submarine warfare to affect German naval strategy comprehensively. Resources that had been allocated to submarine construction were revealed as wasted when hunter-killer groups demonstrated they could sink U-boats faster than German industry could produce them. The submarine arm that had once been Germany's most effective naval weapon became a resource drain that contributed to the overall collapse of German naval power. The final irony was captured in Gross Admiral Dönnitz's surrender message to all U-boats on May 8, 1945. The submarine warfare that carried Germany's hopes for naval victory has been defeated by enemy innovations that transformed our greatest strength into our fatal weakness. We who perfected the art of coordinated attack have been destroyed by enemies who applied our own principles against us with greater efficiency than we ever achieved. History will record that German submarines were not defeated by superior technology alone, but by tactical revolution that our doctrine was incapable of recognizing or countering. The human cost was staggering. Of approximately 40,000 German submarine crew members who served during the war, over 30,000 died. a casualty rate of 75% that made U-boat service the most dangerous assignment in any military force during World War II. The vast majority of these losses occurred after March 1943, when hunter-killer groups began systematic operations that transformed submarine warfare from a contest between predator and prey into methodical extermination of German naval power. The survivors carried psychological scars that would influence naval thinking for generations. Veterans of hunter-killer encounters reported decades of nightmares featuring coordinated sonar pings, and many became advocates for integrated naval coordination in post-war NATO naval doctrine, having learned through bitter experience that individual excellence meant nothing against systematic coordination. Frigate Captain Brenner, reflecting on the transformation 30 years after the war, provided the final assessment. We German submarine crews believed we were the masters of naval warfare, that our training and tactical innovation made us invincible against any defensive system the Allies might develop. We were wrong, catastrophically, completely wrong. The Allies didn't just develop better defenses, they revolutionized their entire approach to naval warfare and made our expertise irrelevant. We learned too late that in modern war, systematic coordination defeats individual brilliance every time. The legacy of the hunter-killer revolution extended far beyond World War II. The tactical principles developed to destroy German submarines became the foundation for modern anti-submarine warfare, influencing naval doctrine throughout the Cold War and beyond. The 783 German submarines lost to coordinated Allied operations became a cautionary tale about the dangers of tactical rigidity and the failure to anticipate enemy innovation. The Battle of the Atlantic had begun with German submarines as the predators, systematically hunting Allied merchant shipping with tactical superiority that seemed unbreakable. It ended with those same submarines as prey, systematically hunted and destroyed by Allied forces who had revolutionized naval warfare through coordination, persistence, and tactical innovation that German doctrine had never imagined possible. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and absolute. German submarine warfare, once the terror of the Atlantic, had been reduced to a footnote in naval history by enemies who had learned to fight the war they needed to fight, rather than the war Germany expected them to fight. The 783 submarines lying on the ocean floor stood as monuments to the price of failing to adapt to revolutionary change in the art of war.